comments, and normally we go right into our panel and then we do the biggest damn lie later in the week, but right now we're going to do it off the top. So here we go, time for they like, damn, that's real big. All right, the political news this week was dominated by the release of a secretly recorded videotape Mitt Romney took at a fundraiser, which was quite interesting, and he insulted nearly half the electorate. Most of us probably have seen it. If you haven't, check out Mitt Romney at his finest with his rich friends.
There are 47% of the people who vote for the president no matter what. There are 47% who live here who are dependent upon government, who believe that they're victims, who believe that government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they're entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. These are people who pay no income tax. And so my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never think they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives.
All right. All right, folks, so lots of discussion this week on that. Romney basically says, I'm going to own it. He is insulting basically half of the country and said, you're voting for President Obama, you're a moocher. Your reaction to it?
There are a lot of things that are wrong with what Romney said, but for me, just as a citizen of this country, for somebody seeking to be leader of this country, to be the president, to say that half of the country just doesn't matter, he's not even going to worry about them at all, I think is pretty amazing. Because you're supposed to be the president for everybody, right?
Well, you would want to be, you would think.
I would think that would matter, so I find that just appalling, just on the base level, for me as a voter.
So I kept wondering who he was talking about specifically. Now, he talked about 47%, and it was a setting where there were a lot of people who didn't necessarily consider themselves part of that 47%. But it almost sounded like another episode of Code. It almost sounded like, well, you know, those people. But the problem is that that broad swath of people gets divided up into like retirees, the military, you know, all kinds of people.
A lot of Mitt Romney supporters are in that 47%.
Absolutely. But it sounded like from the tone of his remark that he was trying to get a message. Now, exactly what that message was, nobody ever called him out on that and asked him specifically who he was talking about because it was so broad. But I'm kind of interested in whether or not that was another example of Mitt Romney being himself and people who were like him, or if it was something like he was trying to send a message to people to try to get them to open their wallets.
Is it even truthful that 47% of the United States does not pay income tax?
Yeah, well, here's the deal. You have the stats where 47% of the country doesn't pay federal income tax, but they are paying payroll taxes. Also, you have tax credits that have been created for earned income tax credit. You have a mortgage tax credit that middle class folks also use. Half of the 47%, to Joe's point, are seniors. Okay, and what really jumps out when you look at that is that many of these tax credits were signed into law by Republican presidents because they were trying to push through big tax cuts like President Ronald Reagan.
I don't think we should get so into the percentage that we forget the other terminology that he used. And the terminology was rooted in dependency. When you talk about healthcare, housing, it strikes images of a welfare system. And
because he said they consider themselves victims, and they don't believe in personal responsibility.
Absolutely, and this is usually code word for people of color, minority groups, immigrant groups, people who are dependent on the government for their support, for their prosperity, people who look like us, essentially. So it's racialized language, and I think the percentage was safe because he didn't have to get into the details of it, right? But he's ultimately talking about people who don't look like him, who don't look like the white, rich donors that were in that space. And he got very comfortable, and I think in that comfortable space, he said things that we would never hear if he was on the campaign trail. And I really wonder, you know, do we understand what it means when he can say those things to wealthy supporters and would refuse to admit to that as how he really feels. You know, it's not mere politics. This is how he essentially feels.
I don't think he knows how he feels. I think at the end of the day, we have seen Mitt Romney in multiple scenarios for the last 2 decades say whatever is necessary at any place at any time. And so I'm not surprised by it. I'm not even offended. What I'm offended by is that he's even running for president. And possibility of being president, the fact that I'm going around the country trying to get people excited to beat Mitt Romney is offensive. And so that's what I'm offended by. I think that we need to continue to push this 47% because I think it's an indication, regardless of who he's talking about, that he's disconnected from the vast majority of American people regardless of party. And that alone makes him ineligible to be the best president that we need, not just during this time, but any time.
One of the things that jumps out is that we've seen this gleeful reaction from supporters of the president, and I've heard people literally say the election is over. We've seen battleground polls showing the president is up in Ohio, in Virginia, neck and neck in Florida, also up in Colorado. But the reality is, if you remember 2008, that election was tight all the way through the middle of October until Senator McCain suspended his campaign when it came to the debt crisis. That's when then Senator Obama really began to pull away. And so I don't get people who are on the left who say this campaign is over. I think they're crazy because we don't know what the impact is going to be with these voter suppression laws, and also what happens when the Romney super PACs start dropping $200 million on ads.
The other reality is that we forget that the GOP will vote no matter what. You could put a rat and a roach as VP and presidential nominees with a GOP t-shirt on, and they would turn out.
So they don't like President Obama.
And they turn out. I think the concern is there's two things. There was a huge bump, at least from an excitement level from the DNC.
From the convention.
And so, yes,
right.
And so there were a number of people that got excited. Secondly, we began to see these numbers that I don't think we expected this early that was showing the president ahead in some key battleground states. I was almost horrified by that because I know what that does for some of us in particular is it says President Obama got it. Right. And on November 6th, if it rains, they like, oh, it's good. I don't need to go out. Right. And so we cannot stop. We cannot rest. We cannot lay back on our laurels. We cannot think that he has it. I don't care if Romney blunders the next 49 days. We need to push and push and push because at the end of the day, we have to make. I want to see the president win by so many votes that it's absurd. Mm-hmm. And if that happens, then fantastic. But we have to make up for the potential ground that's going to be lost by voter disenfranchisement, by confusion, by laziness, and by miscommunication.
How critical will the three presidential debates be to determine what happens on Election Day? Because remember, early voting will be taking place during that period.
I think it's going to be pretty critical because Mitt Romney gets 3 more chances to try to right the wrong.
In front of a national audience.
In front of a national audience. And keep in mind, to Jeff's point, we've already had at least half a dozen gaffes that probably would have sunk a lesser candidate, in different times. But because Romney has this raft of money that he can rely on, and because we've got a lot of disenfranchisement going on, we've also got a lot of subterfuge, a lot of people really suspicious of voting a second time for President Obama, that has allowed him to stay afloat. So he can make his mark in the debates without really having to define his candidacy to this point, which he hasn't really done so far.
Well, I want to make the point. I think voter suppression is something we often talk about, but there's something that happens through the leadership of various communities of faith, for example, where you have pastors who have said they're not going to vote in this election because they can't choose between a Mormon and a president that supports same-sex marriage. So what I am really concerned about are influential people who offer spiritual revelation to people who kind of speak as God's mouthpiece, as well as the debate that you've been having on Twitter over Lupe Fiasco and rappers, and so people who have influence in the decisions that people make, leaving a sense of apathy in people because they say, why vote? I'm essentially choosing the less of two evils. And I think it's absolutely irresponsible for leaders who have their own platforms, who can reach out to millions of people, say, well, on that day, why don't you be silent?
Right.
I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and it's something that I talk about with my